Wow, it looks like Pitt is losing in the WPIAL yet again, but the recruiting efforts aren't really going down across the board. We'll bring on Locked On's recruiting expert John Garcia Jr. to talk about Pitt missing out on local recruit Rodney Gallagher as he heads to West Virginia, what that means for Pitt, and how in the world they can potentially overcome the steep hill it seems they have in the WPIAL locally. That's all coming up today on this episode of Locked On Pitt.
Are Locked On Pitt, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Panthers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Pitt podcast, folks. As always, I love to talk recruiting on here, and we do have a big topic to talk about today with Locked On recruiting expert and Sports Illustrated recruiting expert John Garcia Jr. Folks, we're talking about the WPIAL today because Pitt lost out on Rodney Gallagher last week after he goes to West Virginia, and another WPIAL kid that Pitt misses out on, and this has become a little bit all too familiar for Panthers fans in recent years. Thus, they've landed a few other guys, but the top guys have seemingly left Pittsburgh and have not stayed with the Panthers in recent years. And John, I've seen a lot of other schools that maybe don't have this trouble. They keep a lot of their guys at home, but Pitt has just never seemed to be one of those teams where they can keep all the talent in Pittsburgh, even after an ACC championship win. It really felt like when it came down to it, Pitt didn't have a chance.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear from Rodney Gallagher in terms of when he realized West Virginia was going to be the school for him. He mentioned that basically a month before the decision went public that he was kind of, zeroing in on becoming a Mountaineer. And that one stings in particular, right? I mean, this is a kid who's not only an in-stater, but a guy who's been targeted for such a long time by this coaching staff. And again, like you said, coming off of an ACC title, my goodness, I don't know how much more that Pitt could have hoped for leading into this cycle and this recruit in particular. But it breaks that way sometimes. Technically Morgantown is, I think, closer to where he's from technically, but obviously, it's optically going to play a certain way. It hadn't hurt Pitt too much in the past, just in terms of, not being able to overcome maybe some local standouts going elsewhere. But certainly it's not something that you want. It's not something that you're actively going to just leave alone. You're going to actively recruit against that and try to change a little bit of that perception. But, it's a bit of a lost cause with Gallagher, who's headed, like you said, to West Virginia. But I also think sometimes they're not in the cards, right? Sometimes that the kid has his own philosophy and Pitt doesn't fit all of those things to a certain degree, for better or worse. So I do think there's a little bit of that involved in this recruitment in particular. But look, the class, you've got your quarterback committed. You got another out-of-stater on board. This program is going to cast a wider net than one we've seen in years past because of the resources and the ACC footprint. So you expect that to continue to supplement. But of course, you need Pennsylvanians on the roster, right? I think I did a little bit of Googling earlier. I think 30 plus players on that roster are in-state kids. So about a third of your roster is semi-local. So it's still important. It still certainly matters, but it is not all the be-all, end-all, I should say. So will be interesting to see going forward, of course.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it almost feels like the momentum for Pitt's on the eastern part of the state. Really haven't been able to get in Philadelphia, but have a 4-star commit in 2024 in Jasir Whittington. And we've heard a lot of good things from Philly kids about Pitt in 23 and 24. They're recruiting that upper eastern part as well. Kenny Johnson's a big one. It's them in Penn State for him. Closer to Penn State, that's a keep-at-home Penn State guy. It almost feels like Pitt is almost pulling him out of Central PA there. So that's interesting to me. The question then becomes, if Pitt's recruiting, say, really well in Florida, and it seems like they are, it seems like that is actually boosting. It seems like everywhere else but the WPIAL has gone better for Pitt.
it's you take the good with the bad, right? I mean, it's something that, look, I'm from Florida, I'm biased, but we all understand the talent in the Sunshine State. It's there for a reason. It is supplying. I mean, my gosh, every recent national champion, just look at the Floridians, throughout their roster. And I think when Pitt is at its best, it's able to do that as well, right? I know last show I was on, we talked about Antonio Bryant, right, a Miami native, who obviously did great things up there. So yeah, look, I think you got to continue to push the footprint as much as you can, and getting into Florida, Georgia, the classic ACC footprint certainly bolsters some of that. So I think you take that trade if you're Pat Narduzzi. He won't never say that, but I would take that trade. I would say, hey, I'll lose some of the hyper local guys to go a little bit wider and a little bit more southern in terms of supplying, top prospects to the program. But you're never going to ignore hyper local either way. So there's a lot to unpack there, but it is interesting to see momentum elsewhere. So it's not like it's dead all across the board. There is momentum elsewhere. It's just not, right outside of campus.
Yeah, and again, it's weird. It only seems to be isolated to Pittsburgh, which is the very interesting thing. You would think that the local buzz would get Pittsburgh kids more ready and amped up to play at home. Now, there are some kids that are just tailor-made and are obviously going to go to Pitt. Elliot Donald was one of those kids a few years back, where obviously Aaron Donald is his uncle, and that one was kind of, he had Ohio State in there, Notre Dame, Penn State, but that one was obviously going to be a Pitt commit. Deion Hayes, another kid who's really coming on for them. DeMar Hamlin in the past, Tyler Boyd in the past has come from the WPIAL. The WPIAL isn't what it used to be in the 90s, for example, where it was one of the richest recruiting areas, not just in Pennsylvania, but in the country. But it still produces really good players. So as you said, they're going to push that footprint. Florida, Georgia, they're into New Jersey. Pitt has kind of the good, I guess, good and bad, that they both have their ACC footprint, but they also have the old Big East footprint in their view as well. So they are able to kind of recruit wherever they want to. But what in the world, and I guess, what could be causing this perception from recruits locally? Gallagher, it doesn't sound like Pitt's a big option for Tamir Robinson, another 4-star. What in the world can be causing Pitt to not rise up in perception locally around Pittsburgh, rather than say, why is it going up in Florida, in Georgia, in New Jersey, in New York, in Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, everywhere else? It seems like Pitt is drawing more interest than at home.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First of all, I do think one thing you said kind of stuck with me, Nick. You said that the talent pool overall at the top is not as strong as it once was locally in Pittsburgh. So I do think that could be one element there. And then, it made me kind of hit Google again and look at some of the targets for Pitt, just way wide scope, 30,000 feet look. And there are more scholarship offers sent out by this Pitt staff, according to 24/7 Sports, in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Jersey, California, Virginia. So another, DMV footprint, ACC Big East clashing there, and Ohio, then Pennsylvania in this cycle. Now, is that a coincidence? Is that just kind of a numbers thing and it really doesn't tell the whole story? Maybe that's again from a 30,000 foot view, but I latched that on with what you said earlier. There maybe isn't as much Pittsburgh level talent as there was locally, and as your program elevates, you win more, you have more power in the selection and evaluation process. Maybe there's not enough guys locally that Pitt feels is at a certain threshold to be high priority targets. It doesn't mean Gallagher wasn't, certainly, and I don't want to make it seem that way, but maybe there's not as much of a push from Pitt's perspective with local talent relative to this 2023 cycle. But I was kind of searching for answers out there, but it does seem like that greater ACC and Big East footprint is becoming more important for Pitt recruiting going forward, because we just don't see as many in-state or hyper-local targets at the very top. So when you miss one, it stings a little bit more, like we're talking about now. but it also should remind you of the overall goal and perspective that, hey, this is the changing philosophy, at least just a little bit.
Folks, we'll get back to that in a minute, but first, let me let you know about Rock Auto, because with the ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. You don't have to endure pointless or intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts to their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. Folks, you have access to rockauto.com in your pocket and at home. You don't have to spend 30, 50, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership. Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. You can get anything you might want, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, new carpet, and more. So go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck right locked on in there. How did you hear about us box? So they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, they won their ACC championship this past year with guys largely out of state. Their two biggest players on that team were from New Jersey and Maryland, specifically in Addison and Pickett. And then really their other guys, Cansey's from Florida, Damari Mathis from Florida, Habakuk Baldana's from Italy. I mean, that is obviously but he did play down in Florida. It's all Florida and other areas. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have local kids on that team playing well. They did,
of course.
But it wasn't the crux of their ACC championship roster. So I do find that interesting, and that maybe lends the question of how important is WPIAL recruiting to Pitt's success in the future. There are good recruits coming out next year. Anthony Specca, Quentin Martin. In a future 2025, they got T.Quai Hayes from the Aliquippa area. Obviously, Aliquippa has been a very, very storied program. Darrell Rebus came out of that program. Ty Law came out of that program. A lot of guys that have gone to Pitt there and ended up being great players, obviously. And some of the greatest players in Pitt program history, Dan Marino, Tony Dorsett, have stayed in local areas. But I think you look at it, and I think it is partially that strength area that you talked about, that the WPIAL isn't as good anymore. Now, for Gallagher specifically, he's been being recruited since his freshman year by Pat Narduzzi personally. I have heard that he took on this role personally to try and go get Rodney Gallagher. Now, it didn't work out. Obviously, he went to West Virginia. Tamir Robinson, same way. He's probably not going to Pitt. Probably going to one of Penn State or Miami is what it sounds like with him, which is, again, very interesting that Miami has more pull on a guy like Tamir Robinson from Pittsburgh. But I don't know really what factors it could be. I think that, and I want to get your take on this, because you mentioned how close, Rodney Gallagher is in Laurel Highlands, Uniontown area to Morgantown. Tamir Robinson is in the city, but there's a large contingent of Penn State fans in Pittsburgh, West Virginia fans, Notre Dame fans, Ohio State fans, and then you have Pitt fans as well. But it's not just singularly on Pitt. How does that splinter in? Because I think this is pretty unique to Pitt in that the whole city isn't necessarily Pitt oriented. There's a lot of Penn State, there's a lot of West Virginia, there's a lot of Notre Dame. And I have to think that hurts them a little bit too.
100%. And that is a fantastic point. When we talk about recruiting, right? You think of the powers, right? The teams that have a chance to win recruiting national titles, right? It's Georgia, it's Alabama, it's A&M won it last year, Clemson, Ohio State, right? All of those places, for the most part, pretty far away from big metro areas. So you create a little bit more of a natural pipeline, a little bit more loyalty. People aren't as transient. There's not as many people there, right? The population numbers are lower in Tuscaloosa and Clemson, South Carolina, than anything that Pitt has to offer. So it does make you think about recruiting in general. Apologize for the lightning and thunder here. I'm in Tampa, right? Tampa Bay Lightning. That's why you can hear it. It makes you wonder, though, from a geographical perspective, more metros, more transient folks, more fan bases represented in those metro areas. So that's a great point about Pittsburgh. And then you think of some of a place like Morgantown, West Virginia, it's the total opposite, right? So you do have a little bit more of that, not blind loyalty, but just a consistent loyalty from the population there. So there's good and bad that come from recruiting metro areas, but you can go to any metro in the country and find that, right? LA, Houston, Dallas, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, you find a mixture of folks. And when it gets trickled down to reproduction in kids, those loyalties are all over the place. And again, if you're in the metro, you're coming up that way. Nowadays, you're probably more likely to at least consider looking elsewhere first because of what's available and opportunistically available out there. And I think technology has helped with that too, in terms of having kids growing up in place A and wanting to leave and see what else is out there. I don't think that's a problem that is relegated to just Pitt. I think that's a lot of schools in metro areas or areas where people have left over a certain period of time.
Yeah, in Pittsburgh, specifically, Pitt has had a lot of trouble with the inner cities, and that's obviously very obvious. McKeesport area has been a big one where there's been a lot of talent coming out of there. Kaliki Hudson, for example, went to Michigan out of there. I think Pitt, though, has two interesting things that I want to touch on, because a lot of people from opposing fan bases will point these two things out. And I think I want to start off with the first one is, well, Pitt plays not on campus, and that is the unique thing. They play in Heinz Field, and I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. They also share the facility with the Steelers. I think that's a mostly good thing. But how do you think locally, because it doesn't affect the kids mostly out of state, but locally I can imagine it affects kids a little bit, the fact that Pitt doesn't actually play on campus, they play in Heinz Field where the Steelers play. Do you think that affects their local recruiting a little bit in a negative way?
It does. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's easy to sell that from a broad perspective. Like, hey, we play in an NFL facility, but a person in College Station, Texas will say, yeah, but you don't have 100,000 fans screaming and willing to live and die for your school at every single game, no matter what. So I do think that's an issue. We see that with other schools in that same boat. Miami's immediately comes to mind there, where they're not able to sell that on-campus experience. And when you start to compare and contrast to other programs, it does hurt you. I think it hurts you more than it helps, because it only helps on the front end, right? Oh, NFL Stadium, you're going to be in the same locker room as the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is cool for sure, but it's also something that you could live without, right? Because if you're going to play in the NFL, you're going to play in the NFL anyway. But there is something to be said for, again, the college town atmosphere. I mean, just look at Penn State, right? It's the total opposite. In Happy Valley, it's the total opposite sell once you're there relative to Pitt, even though Pitt is the only one coming off of a conference championship. So you can look at it certain ways, but I think, Pitt and Miami in particular, they're hurt by playing at off campus and at an NFL stadium in a big metro. Those are all kind of whammies that you line up there that don't necessarily help when you dig into the intricacies of recruiting, official visits, all of those things that really make or break some of these pitches. That is not something that is being sold, right? If you're Pitt, how much time are you spending in Heinz Field on an official visit? Probably not as much as Saban is in, Bryant Denny in Tuscaloosa, or Ryan Day is at, their stadium at OSU, because it's not a part of the experience that is exclusive to Pitt itself. So I do think it hurts.
Folks, we'll get right back into that shortly. But first, let me let you know about BetOnline, because our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, MLB scores, fights, and even next season's NFL futures. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Yeah, I would agree with that. And then there's that second part. You kind of touched on it, but it's the attendance factor. And that's the Pitt doesn't get lavish attendance. Not that they don't get great attendance. They had a pretty good attendance overall, 45K this year. But look at WVU, who had a losing season, smaller stadium, and they had over 51,000 average on home games. Pitt only filled about 67% of Heinz Field, and that's obviously led to a ton of different talk around Pitt fans. And that's the jab at Pitt, obviously, is that they don't have great attendance. A lot of fans want to tarp off parts of Heinz Field. There's a lot of different things. The Heinz Field is too big for Pitt, basically, is what I'm trying to say. The undergrad number just isn't there for Pitt. And that's kind of the interesting thing. Pitt just doesn't admit as many, say, Penn State or whoever it might be. So you don't have the raw undergrad numbers. So let's talk about that to a degree. And I kind of drew that back to a Rodney Gallagher, who is going to a school with the whole state on their side that even in a bad season completely just comes out, supports you. You got that country roads, obviously atmosphere going down at West Virginia. It's a completely different dichotomy from Pitt. And I kind of wonder how much this hurts local perception for Pitt, and the fact that, yeah, there are empty yellow seats every Saturday. Even at the Clemson game last year, it was packed. The lower bowl was filled, but those upper seats were all yellow, and I got to think that hurts Pitt too.
Yeah, and look, recruiting it's a really tight business, right? I mean, there is a narrow margin of victory for almost all of these kids, and any little thing that is to your advantage or your detriment could really become a bigger thing very quickly, right? And it's something that if a program chooses to negatively recruit against Pitt, which we know it happens, right? It happens to and from everyone. You know, the old rule was like, don't bring up anyone else, just bring up your program. But it's, again, these coaches' jobs are often dependent on their ability to recruit just as much as the win-loss. When you're doing that and you do bring up a Pittsburgh, that's something that they're immediately going to go to, right? Because every coach has, first of all, been to a million different universities. They've worked at a million different universities, and they know at some point the value of a galvanized community that, like you said, for West Virginia, is there no matter what. Now, obviously, if you're winning, it's there a little bit more, but even when you're not, it's still there to a degree. So like you said, that factor and the undergrad numbers, all that stuff factors into the atmosphere. You talk about Penn State, you know about the whiteout, right? You know it's coming, you know it's a thing. It's something that people are going to talk about and maybe plan for. That doesn't exist for the Panthers. It's not something you can't overcome, but to think that it is not an important factor would be a bit naive, in my opinion, because you are selling your inclusion. If you're recruiting a kid, you're selling his inclusion in this atmosphere. And if that atmosphere isn't something otherwise notable, it has a lesser draw compared to some schools that are almost known for. I mean, Texas A&M's like known for the crowd. That's something that they can always sell. You talk about a program that hasn't really won a whole lot, but they're known for that. And that has certainly helped them on the recruiting trail. That's an extreme example because they just finished with the number one class, but it matters. It does matter when you start to compare and contrast with a school like Pitt. And those are things that, Narduzzi and company have to begin to overcome. They can't fund the stadium on their own, but they could lift up other things when they actually do get face time with some of these prospects. And that's what makes it fascinating. It's truly a different feel and sell relative to, like I said, everywhere in the ACC, maybe outside of Miami, where they're going through some of those same hurdles. And that's part of the reason why they keep firing their coaches.
Yeah, Pitt's found the stability factor, though, with Pat Narduzzi, and have gotten their way all the way to the ACC championship. They've won it. They've gotten to a New Year's Six Bowl. And it seems like Pitt has done a great job of scouting and developing talent, which has been the key for this staff. And again, some of those guys have come from inside the WPIAL. Others have come from outside the WPIAL. A lot of them have come from outside. And that brings me to my question, I guess, of, well, in reality, Pitt losing Rodney Gallagher and probably Tamir Robinson as well. Yeah, that sucks. I think that I would agree with that. But really, in over reality, when you got guys like Hakeem Williams coming, Antonio Robinson coming, Jalen Thompson coming, I think Pitt has something like 9 4-stars coming to campus. Obviously, Hakeem's a 5-star, and they have a ton of high 3 stars that have 4-star, 5-star offer sheets even coming to campus, and it's clear the bump is there. So in reality, to you, I guess, and you said this I think a while back, if they're not going to win now, when will they? How important even is it to win in the WPIAL?
Yeah, I think you have to take it for what it is. If the talent is lesser, which you said, and I trust you on that one, right? Being a local guy, if the talent is lesser and the pipeline elsewhere is growing simultaneously, you have to take it for face value, because if there's one thing that every coach who recruits will tell you is that the resources and the time, they're limited in recruiting. So you have to have a realistic target area. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to ignore these local kids and local schools. But you may be all things even, and you're down to, hey, I got one more day of visits left. If I'm a position coach, if I'm the DB's coach, and there's a kid, in Pittsburgh, and there's a kid in Chicago, and Pitt is in the top 5 for both of them, I might go see the Chicago kid first, just because, first of all, it's further away and there's less likelihood that they can just get in a car and head over. But two, because the numbers are telling us, hey, there's a little bit more traction with this group. So all things even, when it gets to those decisions, I do think that it could become a bit secondary, but it doesn't mean you'll ever ignore it, because wherever the talent is where you need to recruit. And Narduzzi knows that. The whole staff knows that. So it's definitely not a panic point for Pitt fans, but it is something to keep an eye on. And I would be curious the rest of this cycle, not only, locally, but in state, how many Pennsylvanians sign with Pitt in the class of 2023. I'd venture to say that the number is going to be a little low relative to perception, and it could be a trend that is forming as Pitt becomes known more regionally than locally.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point. And I guess the last question I have for you, is there a program that, like Pitt, for example, has not been great at local recruiting, and then has suddenly kind of switched the narrative around a little bit and has suddenly become stronger? And if so, what would that roadmap look like? If Pitt wants to go into the WPIAL, fend off everyone that comes in and say, this is our turf, we get the WPIAL kids, they're coming to Pitt. Is there an example or a blueprint for them to follow for that?
I don't know. I think Miami's going to recruit better locally under Mario Cristobal relative to Manny Diaz. But it's just not the same because of the pool of talent. And I think that's really where this conversation lies. The pool of talent in Miami is so high. There's so much volume that if you need to reverse perception, you're not settling in the process of taking that local kid. I do think there are certain scenarios when you're talking about Pitt relative to Jersey, relative to the DMV, Philly, that all things even, you don't take that kid just to take the kid and say he's local because it's this big issue. Now, it was a big issue at Miami, and that's part of the reason why they fired the last staff. And that's something that Cristobal knows he has to correct, but it's because of the volume down there. So even though he's doing that, I don't think there's a clear blueprint for Pitt here. I think you go where the talent is and you go from there. And some of the trends may piss some folks off, but if you're winning, if you're still sending guys to the NFL, you're still doing what Pitt has done recently, it'll work itself out in the end anyway.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if you fix this without the on-campus stadium and all of that. That's a good ways away. So
exactly.
And that's going to be the question, is if they can even find room for it. Because if you know anything about Oakland, that thing is packed to the brim, not really much room for a football stadium there. Like they have a basketball arena, to be quite honest, on campus right now. All right, John, as always, thanks for coming on. Tell them where they can find your stuff and do all that.
Yeah, Nick, real simple, si.com/college, or check us out on Twitter. I'm at John Garcia _JR.
Folks, as always, thanks for listening. And as always, hail to Pitt.